Hello, I'm Yoram Hazony, and this is NatCon Talk, where nationalism and conservatism meet. Today I'll be speaking with Mary Eberstadt. She's a senior fellow at the Faith and Reason Institute in Washington, D.C., and the author of many books. Her new book is called PRIMAL Screams. Mary Eberstadt, welcome to NatCon Talk.
Thank you, Yoram. Great to be here. Congratulations on the show.
Oh, thank you very much. When we started working on who to invite, I knew that you had to be one of the first people. And for anybody among the viewers who don't know Mary Eberstadt, Mary is, I would say, probably the leading psychologist and theorist of the family in writing in America these days. I first became aware of you. I think it was the early 2000s when your first book came out. The book was called Home Alone America. And I remember reading it and telling my wife, this is just stunning. Why don't we begin there? Why don't you tell us a little bit about what brought you to the question of Home Alone America, to what are we doing to our children? And how'd you come to write about that?
Well, thank you for that kind introduction, Yoram. Home Alone America came about because I was increasingly aware that the empirical evidence of what was going on with America's kids was entirely at odds with the Happy Talk storyline. And the Happy Talk storyline went like this. It's good for children to be separated from their parents, especially their mothers. It's good for them to be socialized in the company of other children at a very early age, et cetera. Now, some of this storyline was, of course, turning necessity to its purpose. In other words, we live in a time when there are a lot of kids without dads in the home, in a time of family breakup. And so some of what people were doing with this ideological happy talk was just trying to keep the trains running on time and stop people from feeling bad. But I thought it was important to put the evidence out there that something about the way that kids are being raised today is causing problems, including for them. And so I assembled a lot of sociological literature, for example, on the subject of psychiatric problems among the young and why they were growing and why everyone who treats young people thinks that this growth is real and not just that we've gotten better at diagnosing it. That problem, I'm sorry to say that I was onto those years ago, has only intensified over time. We are seeing serious disorders among young people on a scale never seen before: anxiety, depression, panic disorders, etc. So part of what I was doing was connecting these kinds of problems to the fact that there are fewer adults, related adults, in the lives of many kids. And this became a theme of my work in general. Over time, I became convinced by the evidence that we modern Western people are living in ways that are unnatural to the kind of creatures we are. We are living as if we can be atomized individuals, and we are suffering for it, and we're suffering for it across the lifespan. Home Alone America dealt with problems among children. At the other end of the lifespan, as I've written about more recently, we see among the atomized old what loneliness looks like in old age. If you Google loneliness studies, in every Western country, you will see that this is the hottest growing stock in sociology. Why is there so much loneliness? Again, because for 60 years, and I do date these problems to the sexual revolution, for 60 plus years, humanity has been living as if we are liberated from basic facts about ourselves from which we can never really extricate ourselves, beginning with our need for one another. And that may sound, gooey and sentimental, but it is anything but if you look at the empirical evidence about what's transpiring in Western societies today as a result of trying to live free from family bonds and other bonds.
You're presenting kind of I would say when you look across all of your books, this theme does come out as kind of like a general theory, let's say kind of a grand theory of what's happening. And I think it might be surprising to some people that that you see the sexual revolution as a very active cause of much of what it is that is going wrong. It's a powerful theory. It's very impressive. Can you walk us through a little bit? How does that causation work?
So the first thing to be said is that in the beginning, when all of this started, there were grounds for optimism, as you say, for the idea that sexual liberation would be a boon for humanity. It would open up possibilities that hadn't existed before. And back in those days, optimistic arguments were made, for example, to say that if there was widespread contraception, it would erase the need for abortion. People made that argument in good faith. And of course, now with hindsight, we know that the opposite was true. We know that rates of contraceptive use, abortion, fatherlessness, divorce, all of these things went up exponentially at the same time, which looks like a great paradox. What explains it? Well, you don't need me to explain it. Perfectly secular economists looking at the data have explained what happened there. Basically, it was that the sexual revolution erased the shotgun marriage. And without the shotgun marriage, marriage deteriorated, not surprisingly. So what has been the result of now decades of these kinds of trends? Honest sociologists in possession of the evidence will say that they have been an almost unmitigated disaster, especially for the weakest among us, for children. There is an entire library full of studies about fatherlessness and kids, showing that fatherlessness in the home is linked to all kinds of undesirable outcomes: truancy, drug use, promiscuity, educational failure, etc. These are feel-bad facts, right? Which is one reason why we don't hear so much about them. But the problem is that sexual liberation turned out to be the least private social phenomenon of all time. In other words, the liberation of the individual went on to have seismic consequences for societies that we are still dealing with, in fact, dealing with more and more. To name just one example outside the area of sex itself, the welfare state has grown mainly as a father substitute. Without a father in the home, the state has had to step in with all kinds of remedies and substitute paternalistic behaviors. As a result, the government of the United States, and not only of the United States, but across the Western world, is under serious fiscal pressure because of the growth of social welfare programs. So there we have a perfect instantiation of the principle that something that was supposed to stay in the bedroom never stayed in the bedroom, and has transformed Western societies. And then that's just one of the consequences we could point to.
I want to pick up. I want to pick up where you were talking about the shotgun marriage, and you're saying, well, you know, it's terrible that we've lost the shotgun marriage. I can sort of hear some of the people who are, you know, in the audience saying, "Whoa, what does that mean? We want to have shotgun marriages? Is the idea that that it's a good thing to force people who don't want to be together into marriage, or is there some kind of an issue here of these sexually liberated men who think that sexual relations actually don't carry any responsibility anymore?" Can you unpack that for us?
No one's trying to force people to be together, but I would like in this context to quote a great liberal thinker, the late Christopher Lasch. Lasch observed that he thought it should be illegal for people to obtain a divorce if they had children in the home under the age of 18. Now, that's probably a shocking thought today, but Lasch formulated it in response to the kind of evidence that I'm talking about, all of which suggests that children need two parents, two parents of the opposite sex is optimal, and they need those parents to be together. So no, I'm not trying to coerce anybody. By some measures, it's thought that in the 1950s in the United States, something like 1 in 5 marriages was a shotgun wedding. That is, for those who might not even know the phrase, a wedding that takes place because the woman has gotten pregnant. This is not about coercion. It's about trying to do right and to acknowledge the suffering of, to do right by the kids who are suffering because of the breakup of the home.
Well, when I was growing up in the States, the argument was that this was 1970s, 80s, 90s. The argument was, what's wrong with allowing people to experiment? They can try living together. If it doesn't work, then you break up. You don't get married. Nothing bad happens. And it seems to me that you, Mary, you have a picture in your mind. I assume that not so different from the one that we try to teach our kids, in which there is a fundamental assumption that the father is going to stay by the mother through all sorts of difficulty and all sorts of pain. And I know I often, when I get to speaking about marriage in front of audiences, I often get to see this reaction that when I talk about the pain of staying married, the pain of raising children, if it's an older audience, if it's people our age, then everybody starts nodding. And if it's a younger audience, I can see that, that people really have absolutely no idea what it is that I'm talking about, because you seem to be describing a situation where there's a right, honorable thing to do. And if there's a child, then the two people who created the child, then they're in it for the long haul. If you don't want to be in it for the long haul, then you don't create the child. Maybe it would be helpful if you would describe how you think that family should work. You said that that a child needs optimally a mother and a father, but do they have to be married? Can they be divorced? And how do you see things happening when parents are having a hard time? Are you basically saying that divorce is not is not an option? I'm not asking you for policy. I'm asking you for your theory of how should this work.
It's only anecdotal, but my observation of life, like I'm sure is true for you too, Yoram, is that sacrifice and self-sacrifice aren't things that are done in a vacuum. They build the people around you up. They make your family stronger. And at the extreme of something like divorce, I think that is also true. And also anecdotally, and probably like you, I've known numerous marriages that came through to a better place after times of great trouble. So again, sacrifice always goes somewhere, and somewhere inside people know this. Now, I don't often have the experience of talking about marriage to an audience, but I do enjoy very much talking to Zoomers and millennials, because as much as they are written off by older people, I find that their aversion to consumerism gives us a lot to work with, because I try to connect that aversion to materialism and consumerism that we see in many younger people to the kind of consumerism unleashed by the sexual revolution. That is to say, it put people in the habit of shopping for people, the sexual revolution as Walmart. And I find that in connecting the dots this way, it's possible to resonate with younger people who are seeing the damages of the sexual revolution in a way that the happy-go-lucky baby boomers who were in on the ground floor of the party don't always. And their popular culture reflects this too. One of the things that I've written about extensively is the ways in which American popular music, for example, reflects the damage out there. When one of the pop superstars of the past decades is Eminem, for example, whose signature themes are family dysfunction, suffering, protectiveness of a sibling, etc. All of these are themes that only become possible in popular music after the sexual revolution. So I sense for all that there is a fear of commitment and other troubles among younger people, Zoomers and millennials, I think there's also a lot there to work with because they have been forced to be realists about the situation of the world after the revolution in a way that many baby boomers never had to be.
One of the things I like about reading your books is the way you use the term post-revolutionary, where the revolution you're talking about is the revolution of the 1960s. And you're actually describing a world that really is post-revolutionary. The idea of the father as it was is in many respects gone. The idea of the mother as it was is in many respects gone. You just wrote an essay for First Things about the disappearance of fathers, not only from families, but in a more general disappearance of the concept of the father in society as kind of a multi-layered issue. Can you tell us what is that about?
So in trying to understand the civil unrest that we see in the United States today, these continuing protests, I'm putting forward a sort of new theory about all of that. A lot of people have looked at Black Lives Matter and related groups, and they've asked essentially, what is supplying this? Like, what theories are supplying this? And as you've written about brilliantly, Yoram, Marxism is the obvious answer. There are various ideologies on the supply side. What I'm trying to figure out is the other side of this. Why are so many young Americans in particular desperate for these collective political identities? I think the answer is that, again, since the 1960s, many people, more and more people, are living in ways that humanity has never lived before. It's not an overstatement. They are living without an earthly father, literally in many cases. They're living without a supernatural father, in the sense that if you look at survey and other data, you can see that Zoomers and millennials are less likely to belong to organized religion than any generation recorded before them. And they are also living with declining patriotism, love of country. There are shocking numbers on that among young people. My point is that this tripartite collapse of the paternal principle is a dynamic in which each of these is reinforcing the other. And since human beings are not meant to live in the absence of some kind of paternal principle, the result is that we are witnessing social breakdown increasingly taken to the streets of the United States. And what I mean by that is, as everyone remarked, Black Lives Matter protests didn't end with taking down Confederate statues. Instead, statues were torn down of town fathers. A statue of Gandhi in Washington, D.C. was defaced. And plenty of people who had never done anything racist had their statues torn down. Now, why is that? My argument is that we're witnessing a fury out there among the dispossessed children of the sexual revolution. We're witnessing an irrationalism, the likes of which has not been seen in public in this way since the 1960s, and even then was not expressed with such wanton disregard for reason. Let me give another example here about campuses and the kinds of dramas that we've seen over issues of identity on campus. Again, when people are down to arguing about Halloween costumes and becoming mobs who get people fired because of Halloween costumes, as has happened on some campuses. We are living in a moment that's not only surreal, its irrationalism seems to be the signature of this moment. Again, the way I think we can connect these dots is to see that people are becoming increasingly unhinged as they are increasingly detached from their own, from their literal families, from the kinds of communities that also served to help people derive their identities, in particular religious communities. We aren't meant to live this way, and we are reaping the results.
At this point, I think I should mention that you have a new book out, which is called Primal Screams: How the Sexual Revolution Created Identity Politics. And the conversation that we're having now is veering directly into the material that's in the book. It's really a very impressive book. It's out. You can order it. And I think one of the central pillars of the discussion in this book is in a section that you call Gone Daddy, where you talk about the absence of fathers from homes and the effect that the absence of fathers has on, I guess we could say, retarding the growth, the emotional maturity of children as they become young adults. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, I'd like to expand it, if I might, Yoram, because yes, fatherlessness is the most visible part of the iceberg. But when you add in all the other changes since the 1960s, the demographic changes of divorce, the shrinkage of the family, which I think is terribly important, what you see is that the basic building blocks of identity are no longer there for many people. For example, if you were to ask me, who are you? I would probably say, well, I'm a wife, I'm a mother, I'm an aunt, I hope to be a grandmother, etc. In other words, I would answer quite naturally by citing my family connections. Or if you were to ask me that question in a religious context, I would say, well, I'm a daughter of the Catholic Church, I'm a child of God. My point, again, is that a lot of people can't point to these things anymore. And I think it's having profound social effects. Let me give an example. I have a chapter in Primal Screams about the Me Too movement, which I thought was suggestive in so many ways. And one of the things that the Me Too movement goes to show is a great distrust and misunderstanding on both sides of the sexual divide, right? Over and over, we have these women who are mostly young, sophisticated women, products of elite universities, finding themselves in these situations that they didn't anticipate and don't know how to get out of. And we find these men who seem to think that they can approach any woman at any time under any circumstances. Why is there such misunderstanding? Part of my theory of this, without judging right or wrong in any given case, is that men and women are increasingly estranged from each other because they have fewer brothers, sisters, fathers in the home, extended family, cousins. In other words, they have fewer members of the opposite sex from whom to learn. I mean, for most of us, that's the template, right? That's how we learn about that strange thing called the opposite sex, by stealthy observation of brothers, fathers, sisters, mothers. And a lot of people don't have that anymore. So the result, which I think is as tragic as it is ironic, is that the most sexually experienced generation in history, say, is also the most sexually illiterate. And I find that a great paradox.
That brings us to one of the most interesting passages in the book, in your book, Primal Screams, is where you're describing the life of a young child growing up at this point, who is attempting to form an identity within the context of what's almost a kaleidoscope of relationships. That, you know, they may have someone that they think is a father, but then the father disappears and then is replaced by somebody else, and maybe then by somebody else. but the same thing can be true for the mother. The same thing certainly can be true for aunts and uncles. Every time there's a shift in the relationships of the adults in the child's life, you write that the child then ends up with all the brothers and sisters, or many of them, becoming former brothers and sisters. And the same with aunts and uncles, if there are any. So between the absolute shrinking of the family, where people just have fewer children and there are fewer brothers and sisters and there are fewer aunts and uncles and there are fewer cousins, and the fact that they kind of rotate because the adult relationships are not stable, then you get us thinking about, well, what's going on in the mind of the child? And in the mind of the child, there could have been a structure that has some kind of permanence, like a permanent hierarchical structure with aunts and uncles and father and mother and brothers and sisters and cousins. And instead of that permanent structure that is the basis for going out into the world and knowing who you are, there's a rotation, a kaleidoscope, a merry-go-round. And that turns into an identity which is soft, is fragile. And you say that that also affects the politics of these children and their public behavior. How does that work?
As human beings, they are desperate to find meaning in life, of course. And it is no coincidence, as the Marxists used to say, that we see identity politics rise with the rise of the sexual revolution. Let me give two examples. The founding document of identity politics is something called the Combahee River Collective, which was a group of African-American feminists. And they wrote a document in which it is thought the term identity politics was used for the first time. And that document is remarkable for two reasons. One, it's one of the saddest documents you will ever read because it amounts to a statement that we are giving up on the men in our lives and we don't count on anyone but people just like us to have our own backs. That is, it starts with this statement of sexual failure. And the other thing that's remarkable about it is that fathers and brothers are not mentioned in the document. So here we have a fundamental indication that the disappearance of paternity and the rise of identity politics are connected at the root. And we just had another reminder of that with Black Lives Matter, whose website, until this was taken down in September, mentioned wanting to undermine or stand apart from the traditional nuclear family. And what was interesting about that statement was that, again, the word fathers was never used, even in the stuff that was taken down. So once more, we see that the rise of these collective identities, whatever they are, feminism, gender identities, etc., is coinciding with the evaporation of the paternal principle in the lives of these younger generations. And my suggestion is that that's what's driving the increasingly impassioned flight to collective identities.
So if I've got this right, people are naturally tribal. People see themselves as attached to the family as kind of the closest collective, and maybe to a broader collectivity, clan, tribe, and so on, and ultimately the nation, of course. And what we're seeing is circumstances under which children grow up with a ruined tribe. They grow up with without the hierarchical structure that the old family used to give them. And much of what we're seeing is the desperate desire to find an alternative tribe. The family didn't give you that structure. The family didn't give you that hierarchy, that place in the world which we call a personal identity. And when that identity is not given in the family, then kids will go out and they will find an identity, all sorts of created, invented identities, which may be much more dangerous than the old identities were.
Yes, very much so. To take one example, the gang problem in the inner cities. The gang problem is largely a daddy problem. And the reason I say that is that there are data, and I quote some of them in the First Things piece that you mentioned earlier, showing that the kinds of kids who join gangs are the kinds of kids who don't have a gang in the home. They don't have a father in the home. Fatherlessness and gang membership are very tightly correlated. So yes, when people turn to alternative identities because they haven't been able to construct a familial identity or a religious identity, invariably these substitute identities are, let's say, imperfect. They're newer. We haven't had as much time to test drive them.
So let's talk about some of the older identities. In your thought, religion is intertwined with the old family structure. It's not just that religion sanctifies the family and gives sanction to the family, but also that the families are the building blocks of the community or the tribe, usually built around, let's say, a church or synagogue. What is the church or the synagogue? It's the collection of families who've decided to band together for various communal purposes, and so I'm not even sure that it's possible to separate your vision of the family from its relationship to Christianity or to religion. Tell us what do you see as the role that Christianity plays or that religion plays in creating this basic tribal unit, the family in the home, and what's the effect in the other direction? How do families create a religion that you'd want to be a part of?
Well, those are small questions, Yoram. Fortunately,
you wrote about them. I just read the stuff.
Thank you. So I did write a book called How the West Really Lost God, and it advances a new theory of secularization. And according to that theory, the religious organizations, churches, the synagogues, are as strong as the families that make them up, and vice versa. That's the short version of the argument. And there is, again, I think a lot of data to back that up. So when we see periods of family vibrancy, as arguably Victorian England was, we also see periods of religious vibrancy. The converse is also true, where we see family breakdown, atomized families, declining marriage, etc. We see the churches in disarray. And the classic example of this is Scandinavia, which is both the most godless territory on earth at this point, and also one in which family fragmentation started earlier than it did in most other Western countries. There are all kinds of reasons why the churches and the family need each other. But the bottom line is that when you see decline in one, you should expect decline in the other.
Is there kind of like a Freudian theory here that would suggest that our Father in heaven is an image of the Father that's in the home, and that when the fathers are absent, then people can't believe in God anymore? Am I reading that into what you're writing, or is that really there?
That's part of it. It's not Freudian. It's just the observation that, again, for reasons that I don't pretend to understand, but that I think we must try to understand, the collapse of these different paternal principles appears to be related. So, for example, how can you explain the idea of God, a loving father, to someone who has never known the earthly version of that? If your idea of a father in the home is a series of mom's abusive boyfriends, you're going to have a harder time making that conceptual leap to, oh, that's what a benevolent father is like. I mean, these are not insurmountable problems, one assumes. We're told never to despair. But they, I think, are playing a real, both prosaic and profound role in the lives of many kids today. The inability to imagine an earthly father is making it harder to imagine a heavenly father.
So your books are not so much about policy. I don't get from reading you a feeling that you're just looking to ask government to come in and save us here. Are there any policies that you consider to be particularly useful for us to think about at this time? I mean, you're describing a fragmentation which is affecting almost every corner of society, including the most religious parts of society. And I don't expect there to be any kind of magic solutions. But when I say to people, well, what's obvious is you need to join a church or a synagogue. You need to, find a gal, find a man, get married, and stick and raise children. I think these things are pretty simple, but they're obviously extremely difficult for individuals at this point to do. When we were talking before the show, I mentioned that my own kids' generation, I can see from my kids and from their friends that there's a tremendous hesitation to take the leap to do any of these things. Even kids who say, yeah, I want to get married, I want to raise children, I want to be religious. I think that their generation is much more hesitant to make any of those commitments than I remember my friends and I being when Yael and I got married and when our friends were getting married. So where do you look for solutions is the wrong problem, but for steps that can ameliorate it? Are there any that you know of?
So as you say, policy isn't my thing, but we all know that the government is not neutral. It's not neutral as between corporations very often. It's not neutral in a lot of ways. And my feeling, given the chaos in which we find ourselves, is that the time for experimentation is upon us. And what I mean by that is to try and tinker around the margins with some of these things. For example, I know that in Hungary, there is an experiment to tie family formation to relieving student debt. That's a very interesting experiment. The idea that families of size might get tax benefits that other families don't, I think that's a very interesting experiment. And the reason I say that is that the government has pretended to be neutral as families don't form and as everybody has to pick up the pieces of that problem. So why can't the government now throw a little bit of weight towards seeing if there are things that might make family formation easier, that might make marriage more attractive, including more financially attractive, et cetera? Because we know that these things are social goods, or at least we know that their widespread absence is a social ill.
In addition to the legal aspects, and you actually wrote an entire book about the persecution of Christians increasingly in liberal societies. But before we get to that, there seems just at the declarative level to be, I think, a tremendous failure when leadership in government, even setting aside the question of what laws are being passed, when leadership in government, the people who are on television, every night talking to you about, what your country stands for, when they, even at the declarative level, feel uncomfortable to declare in favor of traditions and traditional institutions like families and churches, it just seems like it is such an overwhelming burden for young people to have to find their way to family and commitment and religion when the government so clearly has no interest in it and says, you're on your own, make, whatever decisions you want?
Well, I suppose that what we can say about Meyer is that he was in the same situation as some of the other people I was talking about earlier. That is to say, when he was writing, the idea of government as a neutral gatekeeper may have made more sense. We have less excuse for believing in that today because we have decades of experience behind us showing that these are not individual value neutral choices that people make. We don't think that it's right to be indifferent between the family and the absence of the family. And by the way, you don't have to believe anything religious to see how that's true. In the book, Primal Screams, I make a lot of use of literature from animal science, which I find fascinating. And it pertains directly to this issue of the family as the first and most important unit for human beings, because the more we study other animals, the more we see that they are intensely familial. And this is true across the animal kingdom. Not all are monogamous, but all are familial. And this turns out to protect the animal, the human animal and other animals, because animals learn by watching others. This is something that was also not very well understood until recently with better observation. But they aren't born knowing how to be monkeys, for example, any more than we are born knowing how to do algebra. These things are taught, and typically in the animal kingdom, they are taught by siblings and by parents. And so, although we aren't a perfect overlay with the rest of the animal world, we do have a lot of that in us. And I think it is germane to point to these studies and say, why is it when it comes to elephants, we can have animal welfare activists insisting that they be taken out of circuses because they're such familial animals that the suffering engendered by separating them from one another is intolerable. We can see this, Yoram, when we are talking about other animals. We just have trouble seeing it in ourselves.
Let's move to the issue of religious persecution. You did write a book a few years ago. It's Dangerous to Believe, and I want you to say a little bit, if you're willing, about how you see it as becoming dangerous to be a religious person in America or in Western countries today. That's something that I've heard people say before, but it sounds alarmist. It sounds like it can't possibly be true.
What first drew my attention to this subject was talking with an English barrister, Paul Diamond, who does religious persecution or religious liberty cases in England. And he was full of horror stories about, the truck driver who left a crucifix on the dashboard and lost his job because of it, and the street preacher who was thrown into jail for quoting passages from Leviticus aloud on the street. And at the time, this was 10 years ago or so, I thought, well, it would never happen here. I thought, that's England. We have a constitution that protects us from things like that. And then we saw more and more of these religious liberty cases in the United States. So I would like to share two thoughts about that. One is that I have argued that with the decline of organized religion in the US, since the theotropic instinct is ineradicable in human beings, we are seeing now the rise of these quasi-religions, and the foremost one, I believe, is a quasi-religion rooted in the prerogatives of the sexual revolution. In other words, this is what we see when we see demonstrations at the Supreme Court where women dress up like handmaidens. This is what we see in the hysteria over Supreme Court appointments. There is a secular religion out there. Abortion is its sacrament, and the religion is aimed at protecting the liberties accorded by the sexual revolution by any means possible. So that's one thought about the religious liberty cases. They are on the rise because of the largely unseen competition between organized religion in the traditional sense and this religion, this quasi-religion, whose theology derives from the sexual revolution. The second point that I would make about these cases is that there is another kind of unseen struggle going on out there. With the demise of the paternal principle, with more and more people who are disconnected from fathers, from church, from country, I believe we're in a situation like the situation in King Lear, where Edmund, the bastard brother, hates Edgar, the brother born got twixt legal sheets, I think is the phrase. So you have an illegitimate brother and a legitimate brother, and the illegitimate brother cannot bear to see the patrimony enjoyed by the legitimate brother. And so part of the play is about Edmund's secret attempts to destroy his brother Edgar because he can't bear that Edgar has secured a patrimony. I believe in the civil unrest in the United States today, we see traces of that same struggle. And I think we see traces of that struggle in these religious liberty cases, because this is not a matter of live and let live. The people who want to destroy Christian charities, for example, like adoption agencies, want those destroyed wholesale. They don't want to make peace over this. They want this religious stuff and this religiously inspired stuff to go away. They hate this stuff. And I think the reason they hate it is that, again, being disconnected from so many things that are elemental to human beings, there is a fury out there, a kind of free-floating fury. And I think it has come to attach itself to organized religion, it is part of why there's such vituperation on the left whenever someone sticks up for the traditional family or for the traditional Judeo-Christian moral code. We have to understand that deep passions are at work, not only on the religious side, which is all anyone ever points to, but also on the other side. And I think those passions have been stirred up by the fact that many people now can't figure out to have what the traditionalists have, whether it's God, whether it's family, the equivalent of a secure patrimony.
Let's say that we agree with you. I actually remember one of the first essays that I ever wrote back in the 1980s for a student magazine made a similar argument. I was arguing that there was a new religion that was associated with Enlightenment liberalism, and that religion was displacing Christianity as the dominant religious force in society. Back then, I think most of my friends thought that it was wildly exaggerated, but today it does look more and more like an alternative religion. And as you say, it's actually a missionary religion. It's a religion which thinks that there's one right way to think, and people like you and me don't think the right way. Right? And if we have a missionary religion that wants to wipe out, Christianity and Judaism and their influence in society, well, that's going to give us a lot of heartache if the government adopts that religion. And I think that maybe that is in fact what we're seeing in the current arguments about the Supreme Court, which is that conservative religion is no longer something that people want to allow to have influence. I mean, we're just not in a democratic situation where people say, okay, if you win the election, then you get to make decisions, and if I win the election, I'll get to make decisions, and we'll take turns. Instead, we're looking at circumstances where religious believers in this in what you're calling this secular universalist religion. I would say that it's liberal universalist, but whatever it is, they are unwilling to allow the old religions to have any more influence because they've got the right religion and they're going to make sure that all of us knuckle under and become part of it.
And again, I think the sexual revolution is fundamental here. This secular religion is threatened by anything that touches, even in the smallest way, on the edifice of the revolution. This is why we can't even have, abortion illegal up to the moment of birth. It's why we see this extremism, because I think there is a terrible fear on the part of these new religionists that if you take anything away from their edifice, the rest of it will fall down. And I'm not sure they're wrong about that. It's why we see the frenzy over transgenderism today, which again goes back to the argument of primal screams. The shock would be if we didn't see widespread gender confusion, Yoram, because people are not living with enough examples in their lives of what the opposite sex is like. So that one's no surprise. What wasn't foreseen was the entire progressive left lining up behind this phenomenon. But I think, again, that goes to the thought that if they don't, they might lose everything else that they're trying to defend. So, in other words, I think this religion is more vulnerable than it seems at first glance.
Wow, that's very interesting. I hope you're right, and I hope people listening take it to heart, because we could definitely use some hope. Listen, Mary, I read that you were an assistant to Jeane Kirkpatrick before this whole career discussing family. You were helping one of the leading conservative foreign policy thinkers and strategists that America had, and then subsequently founded a society, a Jeane Kirkpatrick Society, that continues to honor her to this day. Could you share? I know that a lot of our listeners don't remember Jeane Kirkpatrick. Could you tell us a little bit about what did you see in her, and why a Jeane Kirkpatrick Society?
So I was very fortunate in my mentors, Yoram. It's one of the things for which I'm most grateful. And I met Jeane Kirkpatrick, who was then our ambassador at the United Nations, because I was working for Irving Kristol as an editor at the Public Interest magazine. And it turned out she needed some ghostwriting help. And Irving kindly sent me to her. So that was how I met her. I was with her for 6 months. I adored her. She was very maternal. Of course, she was brilliant. She took an interest. She gave me theater tickets and concert tickets and invited me to her home. And I just thought she was an exemplary human being. And I enjoyed that time very much.
I know that you and Nick have been married for 33 years, and you're raising 5 children. Is that right?
4 children.
4 children.
Well, 5 if you count Nick, but 4.
So, tell us a little bit about what makes it possible to remain married for 33 years, and God willing, for another 33 or more. A lot of people who are writing about the subject, they read these very cerebral books of yours, but in fact, the books are all informed by real personal life experience. Can you share any kind of insight into how to make it work?
Well, I think a sense of humor is essential, but also, and in all seriousness, this is why I am hopeful. I think knowing what happens when sacrifice and self-sacrifice aren't enough is a very powerful inducement to try as best one can to keep sacrificing and self-sacrificing. And what I mean by that is that the world is full of the wreckage after the sexual revolution. It is full of suffering people. And I very much include in those ranks progressives themselves. If you read women's literature, if you read anything that women of the left write, it is shot through with misery and complaint. It's joyless. And I think it's because trying to live like rugged feminist individuals is making people joyless. So part of the secret to getting through the hard times, I think, is understanding that they could be even harder, understanding what loneliness really can look like in people who never found someone or never found a community to belong to, let alone a family. So understanding that things can be a lot worse is maybe the beginning of wisdom in this.
Wonderful. Mary Eberstadt, thank you for joining us on NatCon Talk.
Thank you, Yoram.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of NatCon Talk. Don't forget to like and subscribe and hit that notification button so you don't miss us next time.